at 11:47 p.m., inside a crowded luxury restaurant in downtown Chicago. The bottle hit the floor before the wine did. Glass shattered. 200 guests froze. Harper Evans stood in front of Julian Vance, her hand still shaking, red wine dripping down his expensive suit. "You spent 6 weeks trying to make me small," she said, her voice low but sharp. "But you can to buy my dignity." Julian slowly lifted his eyes. His jaw tightened, but behind the anger, something darker flashed across his face. Guilt. Then Harper turned away. But before she reached the kitchen door, a cold voice behind her said, "You should have run when I gave you the chance." That night, Harper thought she had only humiliated a cruel rich man. She didn't know she had just exposed a mafia boss, started a war, and become the only woman powerful enough to change him. Stay with me until the end, because this is the story of the waitress he tried to break and the woman who destroyed his empire from the inside. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment your thoughts below. The bottle hit the floor before the wine did, glass first. Then the sound of 200 people going quiet all at once. Harper Evans stood over Julian Vance with her hand still raised. Red wine dripping off his jaw and down the front of a suit that probably cost more than her rent. Nobody in the restaurant moved. Even the kitchen had gone still, the clatter of pans cut off mid-swing. 6 weeks. That was how long Julian Vance had been coming into this restaurant, sitting in the corner booth, ordering the same steak, and finding some new way to humiliate her every single time. He'd ask the manager, loud enough for the whole room to hear, if the kitchen had a scale big enough for the waitress. He'd tip her $1 and slide it across the table like he was feeding a stray dog. He'd smile while he did it. That was the part she hated most. He always smiled. Tonight he'd gone further. He'd asked her, in front of a table of businessmen, if she'd ever considered a job that didn't require standing. Harper set down the tray. She didn't raise her voice. "You've spent 6 weeks trying to make me small," she said. "It hasn't worked. I get up every morning. I put on my apron, and I do my job well. You can mock my body all you want, Mr. Vance, but you can't touch what's inside it. That part isn't for sale, and it isn't for you to insult." Then she picked up the bottle and poured it over him. Nobody in the restaurant breathed. Julian Vance sat there with wine running down his collar, and for 1 second, something flickered across his face that wasn't anger. Harper didn't have time to name it. She turned and walked toward the kitchen, waiting for the sound of a chair scraping back, a hand on her arm, something. It never came. What she didn't see, because her back was turned, was the man 3 tables over lifting his phone and pressing record. She clocked out 15 minutes later, hands still shaking, half expecting security to be waiting for her at the door. Instead, she found her locker exactly the way she'd left it. She grabbed her coat, her bag, and a folded envelope tucked behind her time card that hadn't been there that morning. She almost left it. She almost didn't care what it was. But her sister's name was written on the front, in handwriting she didn't recognize, and that was enough to make her stop. Inside was a cashier's check. Harper read the number twice, then a third time, because the first 2 times her brain refused to accept it. It was the exact amount of Grace's hospital bill. Not close, exact, down to the cent. Like whoever wrote that check had pulled the number straight off the billing statement sitting on Harper's kitchen table. Underneath the check was a note, 4 words, in the same unfamiliar hand. "I'm sorry. Now run." Harper stood in the alley behind the restaurant with the envelope in one hand and her keys in the other. And she didn't run. She looked around instead, scanning the fire escapes, the dumpsters, the mouth of the alley where it opened onto the street. Nothing, no black cars, no men in suits. Just steam rising off a grate and the distant sound of traffic. She thought about Julian Jensen's face when the wine hit him. That flicker. She hadn't been able to name it in the moment, but she could now. Standing here with a check that would save her sister's life folded in her fist. It had looked like guilt. None of it made sense. Men like Julian Vance didn't apologize. They didn't slide envelopes into lockers with exact figures typed out like a peace offering. Men like him mocked waitresses for sport and left before the check came. And everyone was supposed to be grateful he'd shown up at all. She thought about walking back inside and throwing the check on his table the way she'd thrown the wine. Some petty, furious part of her wanted to. But Grace was in a hospital bed 2 miles from here, running out of time and running out of money in exactly the same breath. And pride didn't pay medical bills. Harper folded the check into her coat pocket, next to her heart, where it would stay warm and safe and unbroken until she could get to the beginning in the morning. She didn't know yet that the video was already climbing past 10,000 views. She didn't know that by sunrise. Her face would be everywhere, stitched into a caption calling her a hero, a punchline, a headline, depending on which corner of the internet had found her first. She didn't know that Julian Vance's apology, the one act of decency he'd managed in 6 weeks of cruelty, was about to detonate both their lives. Right now, all she knew was this: she had enough to save her sister. And somewhere behind that steak dinner and that smile and those 6 weeks of small daily humiliations, there was a man who had looked, for one unguarded second, like he regretted every single one of them. She just had no idea how wrong that regret was about to go. By the time Harper woke up, the video had a name. Someone had titled it "Waitress Destroys Mafia Boss" and stitched a laugh track under the part where the bottle hit the floor. 400,000 views, then 600,000. Her phone buzzed itself off the nightstand twice before she even sat up. She almost laughed at first. It felt like a joke someone else was living. Then she opened the comments. The first 100 were about Julian Vance, about who he might be, about the suit and the smirk and the mystery of a man who didn't flinch when a woman soaked him in Cabernet. Somewhere around comment 200, the tide turned, and it turned on her. They didn't talk about what she'd said. They talked about her arms, her stomach, the way her apron sat across her hips. Someone had zoomed in on a still frame and circled her body in red, captioned it like a diagram. Another account reposted the clip next to a photo of a whale. Harper set the phone face down on the bed and stared at the ceiling until her eyes stopped stinging. Her manager called at 9. He didn't bother with small talk. "We're getting calls," he said. "Reporters. Some of them not so nice. Corporate wants you gone before lunch. I didn't ask for this," Harper said. "He humiliated me for 6 weeks. I finally said something back, and now I'm the one losing my job. I know it's not fair. Doesn't change what I have to do." A pause, long enough that she could hear the kitchen noise behind him, the hiss of the grill. A life that was still going on without her in it. "I'm sorry, Harper, I really am." She hung up before he could say anything else. Sorry didn't cover rent. Sorry didn't cover Grace. She called the hospital next, because that was the only number that actually mattered. And a woman in billing kept her on hold for 11 minutes before delivering the second gut punch of the morning. Administration had flagged the account. Somebody somewhere had made a call about security concerns tied to a viral incident involving organized crime, and until that concern was resolved, they couldn't guarantee continued care past the week. "My sister has leukemia," Harper said, very slowly. Like saying it clearly might make the woman on the other end understand. "She's 14. She needs that bed. I understand this is difficult, ma'am." It wasn't difficult. Difficult was a math problem. This was something else. Something with teeth. Harper spent the rest of the morning watching her name get smaller in every direction. The restaurant scrubbed her from the staff page. A blog picked up the story and ran a headline calling her the viral waitress. Like waitress was the whole of her. Like viral was a disease she'd caught instead of a sentence she'd said out loud because nobody else would. She checked her bank app out of habit. Saw the cashier's check had cleared overnight exactly like it was supposed to, and felt no relief at all. Because a bed in a hospital that didn't want her sister anymore wasn't worth much. By early afternoon, the story had a life of its own, and Harper had stopped being a person in it. She was a punchline, a cautionary tale, a body other people got to have opinions about. She thought about calling Julian Vance. She had no number for him. No way to reach the man who'd apparently decided her humiliation was worth 6 weeks of his time, then decided her rescue was worth an envelope and 4 words. She hated that some small, stupid part of her wanted to hear his voice anyway. Wanted an explanation for why any of this was happening. Instead, she packed. If the hospital was going to move Grace, Harper needed to be ready to move with her, wherever that ended up. She folded shirts she didn't remember buying, stacked bills she couldn't pay, and cried exactly twice, quick and furious, like her body was rationing itself. She was zipping the second bag when her front door came off its hinges. Not a knock, not a warning, just a crack of splintering wood, and then 3 men filling the doorway, guns already up, moving like they'd done this before and were bored by how easy it was. Harper's whole body went cold and very, very still. The kind of stillness that isn't calm. That's just the mind buying itself an extra half second to figure out if running is possible. It wasn't. The apartment had one door, and they were standing in it. The lead man scanned the room, found her, and smiled in a way that had nothing warm in it. "Miss Evans," he said, "Mr. Thorne would like a word." Harper's eyes went to the patch stitched into his jacket, a stylized wolf's head she didn't recognize. And some instinct older than thought told her this had nothing to do with Julian Vance. This was something new, something worse. She backed toward the kitchen counter, hand closing around the only thing within reach. A heavy ceramic mug that wouldn't stop a bullet and wouldn't slow a man twice her size. It didn't matter. Some part of her had decided a long time ago, maybe back in that restaurant with the wine bottle in her hand, that she wasn't going to just stand there and let things happen to her anymore. "I don't know any Mr. Thorne," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she expected. "You will," the man said, and stepped forward. That was as far as he got. The window behind him exploded inward, and before the glass had finished falling, the man closest to Harper dropped, boneless, a dark stain already spreading across his shirt. The other 2 spun toward the noise, weapons rising, and the second shot took one of them in the shoulder, spinning him into the wall hard enough to crack the drywall. Harper hit the floor on instinct, mug still in her hand, ears ringing. The world reduced to muzzle flashes and the smell of gunpowder filling her small apartment. When it stopped, 3 bodies were on her living room floor, and Julian Vance was standing in the shattered window frame with a gun in each hand and blood that wasn't his own spattered across his sleeve. "I told you to run," he said. For a moment neither of them moved. Harper stayed crouched by her kitchen counter. Mug still raised dazed like it might do anything against a man who'd just cleared a room with 2 guns and didn't look particularly winded by it. Julian stepped over the nearest body without glancing down, the way another man might step over a fallen umbrella, and crossed to the broken window to check the street below. "Clear," he muttered, mostly to himself. Then he turned, and for the first time since he'd crashed through her wall, he actually looked at her. "Are you hurt? Am I hurt?" Harper's voice cracked on the second word, and she hated it. Hated that fear could still find her voice after everything. "There are 3 dead men in my living room. 2 dead. 1 still breathing." For now, Julian holstered 1 gun, kept the other loose in his hand, and started dragging the barricade together. An old bookshelf, the couch. Anything heavy enough to buy them time. "We don't have long. Thorne's men will send more once these 3 go dark." Thorne, Harper stood, legs shaking, and made herself stay upright. "Who is Silas Thorne? And why does he think he can kick down my door and drag me somewhere?" Julian didn't answer right away. He finished shoving the couch against the door frame, then stood there with his back to her, shoulders tight. Like the question had cost him something to hear. "Because of me," he said finally. "He's been circling my organization for months, looking for a weakness. A few weeks ago, he found one, Yumi. He had men watching this restaurant before you ever poured that wine on me. He'd figured out I came here every week, figured out there was a waitress I kept talking to, and he decided that made you useful. Leverage, a woman he could grab to control me." Julian finally turned around. "I found out first. I thought if I made you hate me, made you quit, made you disappear from that restaurant and off his radar entirely, you'd be safe. I thought cruelty was the fastest way to save your life." Harper stared at him. Somewhere behind the anger building in her chest, pieces were sliding into place. The mockery, the tips thrown like scraps, the envelope in her locker. "You spent 6 weeks humiliating me," she said slowly, "because you decided that was easier than telling me the truth. Yes, you didn't ask me. You didn't warn me. You just decided, all on your own, what I could handle and what I couldn't. And then you took it upon yourself to strip away my dignity in front of an entire restaurant because it was convenient for your plan. I was trying to keep you alive. You were trying to control the outcome. Harper snapped, and it felt good, finally, to aim 6 weeks of swallowed rage at the man who'd earned it. There's a difference, Julian. A man who wants to protect someone talks to her like she has a brain. He doesn't turn her into a public joke and call it a rescue mission. Julian's jaw worked. He looked, for the first time since she'd met him, genuinely uncertain. Like a man doing arithmetic that wasn't coming out the way he'd expected. I don't know how to do it the other way, he said, where I come from. Protection means control. You keep people small. You keep them close. You keep them from making choices that get them killed. That's what safety looks like in my world. Then your world is broken. Harper's voice softened, but only slightly, only enough to make room for what came next. You didn't save me. Julian, you humiliated me and stripped away my choices. And you called it love before you even knew what love looked like. Taking a woman's dignity to ensure her safety isn't protection. It's just a different kind of cage. Dressed up so the man holding the key gets to feel noble about it. The apartment was quiet except for the wounded man's ragged breathing across the room and the distant wail of a siren that hadn't found this address yet. Julian sat down slowly on the arm of her couch, the same couch he'd just shoved against a door to save her life, and looked at his hands like he was seeing them for the first time. My father raised me the same way. He said, keep the people you love in a box. Tell yourself it's for their own good. I watched him do it to my mother for 20 years, and I hated him for it. And somehow I still turned into him inside a single month. So stop. I don't know how. Harper crossed the room, stepped over the man Julian had shot, and stood in front of him. He didn't look up. She waited until he did. You start, she said, by asking instead of deciding. You start by telling people the truth, even when the truth is inconvenient. You start by treating my choices as mine, even the ones that scare you. Julian was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached into his jacket, drew the second gun and held it out to her. Grip first, shoot me, he said. If that's what it takes to make this right, I won't stop you. I'd rather die honest than keep living the way my father taught me. Harper looked at the gun. She looked at him, kneeling there in her ruined apartment, offering her the one thing that would end this cleanly. And she understood, suddenly and completely, that he meant it. She didn't take the gun. I don't want you dead. She said, I want you to actually change. Put that away. And let me show you what it looks like to stand next to someone as an equal instead of over them. Something in Julian's face broke open. Relief and disbelief tangled together. And for the first time since the wine bottle hit her floor. Harper thought maybe this wasn't a war she'd have to fight alone. Outside, the siren was getting closer. We need to move, Julian said, holstering the gun. Now. The compound didn't look like anything Harper had pictured when Julian said the word compound. No barbed wire. No armed men pacing a perimeter in plain sight. Just a tall stone wall, old growth trees, and a house that looked more like a private university than a criminal headquarters. Inside, though, the security was everywhere. Cameras tucked into corners, reinforced glass in every window, a control room manned around the clock. Harper spent her first 3 days there sleeping more than she'd slept in months. Exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with rest, and everything to do with finally being somewhere no one could kick down the door. Grace had been moved too, quietly, to a private facility 2 states away under a name that wasn't hers, paid for in full, guarded by people Julian trusted with his life. Harper called every night. Every night, her sister's voice sounded a little stronger. And every night, Harper let herself believe a little more that this might actually work out. It was on the 4th day that she noticed the discrepancy. She'd been sitting in on one of Julian's briefings, mostly out of boredom, mostly because staying in her room made her feel like exactly the kind of caged woman she'd told him she refused to be. His right hand, a lean, quiet man named Marcus, was walking through security logs, listing off which routes were compromised, which safe houses were still clean. Harper had spent 6 years waiting tables, reading tables, actually, reading which customer was about to complain before they opened their mouth, which one was lying about a food allergy, which one was going to walk out on the check. She'd built a whole skill set on the strength of paying attention to what people's against what their bodies did. Marcus's body was saying something his mouth wasn't. You said the North Safe House was clean 2 days ago, she said, cutting into the middle of his report. Today you're saying it's compromised. What changed? Marcus barely blinked. New intelligence. From where, Miss Evans? I don't think this is answer her, Julian said. And something in his tone made the whole room go quiet. Marcus didn't have an answer. Not a real one, anyway, just a stammered string of half-explanations that didn't add up. That hadn't added up the whole time Harper had been listening if she was honest with herself. Julian's face went cold in a way she was starting to recognize. The look of a man doing arithmetic and not liking the sum. 2 hours later, in a room Harper wasn't invited into, Julian got the truth out of Marcus. He came to find her afterward, jaw tight, hands still faintly trembling. He's been feeding information to Thorne for months, Julian said, small things. Enough to make it look like bad luck instead of betrayal. What happens to him? He's dealt with. Julian didn't elaborate, and Harper didn't ask him to. There were parts of this world she still didn't want to look at directly. Not yet, maybe. Not ever. And Julian seemed to understand that without her needing to say it out loud. You believed me, she said instead. In there, you didn't brush me off. You were right. Julian sat down across from her, close but not crowding her. A small thing that had started to mean a great deal. I spent 6 weeks deciding what was best for you without asking. I'm trying not to make that mistake again. You're doing better. I have a good teacher. That night, with the mole found and dealt with and the compound feeling, for the first time, like it might actually hold. Something between them finally loosened. Julian found her on the back terrace, wrapped in a blanket against the cold, watching the stars come out over the wall he'd built to keep the world away from her. I used to think I had to earn softness, he said, sitting beside her. That it was something you traded for power. I don't think that anymore. What changed your mind? You did, every time you told me the truth instead of what I wanted to hear. Harper turned to look at him, and for once there was no fear in it, no bracing for the next cruelty. Just a man who'd spent his whole life mistaking control for love, finally learning the difference. He reached up and traced the curve of her cheek, and when he spoke again, his voice had none of the armor she'd first met him with. You are the most beautiful thing I have ever tried to protect, he said, and the first time I've ever wanted to protect someone by standing beside her instead of over her. Harper didn't have a clever answer for that. She didn't need one. She leaned into him instead, let the blanket fall between them. Let 6 weeks of humiliation and 6 days of terror finally give way to something gentler. Later, in his room, with the compound quiet around them and the weight of everything they'd survived, finally set down for a while, Julian showed her, without a single word of mockery, exactly how wrong he'd been about every cruel thing he'd ever said to her. There was no smirk in it, no performance. Just a man paying careful, patient attention to a woman he'd almost lost before he understood what he had. Harper fell asleep in his arms, feeling something she hadn't felt in longer than she could remember. Safe, not caged. Safe. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand sometime after 2 in the morning. She didn't hear it at first. Tangled in sleep and warmth and the steady rhythm of Julian's breathing beside her. The second buzz woke her. She reached for it out of habit, expecting a message from Grace's night nurse, and instead found an anonymous live stream link. Already 30 seconds in, Harper blinked the sleep out of her eyes, tapped play, and felt her whole body go rigid. It was her restaurant. Men Thorne's colors were dousing the front windows in gasoline, laughing at something off screen, and as she watched, one of them stepped back, lit a flare, and threw it. Julian, her voice came out strangled. Julian, wake up. The last place that had ever felt like hers before he did. The one thing Thorne hadn't already touched. Went up in flame on a 4-inch screen while she watched, helpless, from a bed that suddenly didn't feel safe at all. They made it to the restaurant in 11 minutes, which was 10 minutes too late. Julian drove faster than Harper had ever seen anyone drive, weaving through empty pre-dawn streets with one hand on the wheel and the other on his phone, barking orders to men who were already too far away to matter. Harper sat in the passenger seat with her knees pulled to her chest, watching the orange glow build against the skyline before they'd even turned onto the block. By the time the car stopped, the restaurant was a torch. Flames punched through the roof, sending up a column of sparks that lit the underside of the smoke like something alive. Firefighters had a perimeter set up, hoses arcing uselessly against a blaze that had already eaten through the kitchen and was working on the dining room. Harper stood on the sidewalk in her coat, no shoes, and watched 6 years of her life curl into ash. This was where she'd learned to read a room, where she'd worked doubles to help cover Grace's first round of treatment, back before the diagnosis got worse. Back when everyone still thought a few rounds of chemo would be enough. This was the corner booth where Julian used to sit and mock her. And somehow, impossibly, it had also become the place where all of this started, where she'd found the courage to stop being small. Now it was smoke. "Ma'am, you need to stay back," a firefighter said, guiding her toward the barrier tape. And Harper let herself be moved because there was nothing else to do. Julian stood beside her, jaw set, radio pressed to his ear, listening to a stream of updates that only seemed to make his face harder with each one. Her phone buzzed. She almost didn't look at it, too numb to care about anything that wasn't burning right in front of her. But habit made her check. It was her banking app. A notification. Then another. Then a third, stacking up faster than she could read them. Withdrawal. 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 Harper's stomach dropped as she watched the numbers cascade down towards zero in real time. The medical fund Julian had paid off. The small cushion she'd managed to save. All of it draining out through some digital pipe she couldn't see and couldn't stop. "Julian," her voice barely carried over the roar of the fire. "My accounts. They're being emptied right now." He grabbed the phone from her hand, eyes scanning the screen, and swore under his breath. "Thorne's cyber team. They've had access longer than we thought." He was already dialing someone else. Already trying to build a wall around a house that was already flooding. Harper watched the last of her balance disappear into a string of zeros and felt something colder than grief settle over her. Not just money. Control, whatever fragile independence she'd managed to hold on to through all of this. The ability to say she'd paid for something herself was gone in the time it took a fire truck to unspool a hose. That was when the choppers arrived. 2 of them. Spotlights swinging down out of the smoke like the sky itself had turned against them. Harper threw an arm up against the glare, and in the sudden white wash of light, she saw men pouring out of vans that had pulled up on the far side of the barrier tape. Not fire department, not police, not really, though they wore the vests and the badges. SWAT, Julian said. And for the first time since she'd met him, real fear crossed his face. "Thorne bought a warrant. That's not possible. It's very possible, if you own the right judge." They came fast, boots on pavement, shouting commands that didn't leave room for questions. Harper found herself shoved back against a parked car, hands zip-tied without a word of explanation, while 3 men forced Julian to his knees on the wet asphalt. He didn't fight it. That scared her more than anything. Watching a man who'd cleared a room of armed intruders without hesitation choose, deliberately, not to resist a squad of corrupt officers. "Don't," he said to her, low, urgent, while a knee pressed between his shoulder blades. "Whatever happens, don't fight them. You'll only give Thorne an excuse." "Julian, listen to me." His eyes found hers across the chaos, steady even with his cheek nearly scraping the pavement. "Trust no one, not even my blood. Do you understand? Not Arthur, not anyone at the compound. You get somewhere safe, and you wait. I don't even know what that means. You will." They dragged him up by the arms and marched him toward an armored vehicle. And Harper screamed his name into the smoke, and the chopper wash, and the general chaos of a night that had already taken her restaurant and her savings. And now, apparently, the one person who'd finally started making her feel like herself again. The vehicle doors slammed. The engine turned over, and then it was just Harper, standing barefoot on a curb with her hands still zip-tied behind her back, watching taillights disappear into a city that suddenly felt enormous and empty at the same time. A young officer, one of the few who looked genuinely uncomfortable with what had just happened, cut her hands free without meeting her eyes. "You should get somewhere," he muttered. "This isn't a safe corner to stand around on." He wasn't wrong. Harper watched the flames finally start to lose their fight against the hoses, watched her restaurant collapse in on itself one beam at a time, and understood. with a clarity that felt almost peaceful in how simple it was. That she had nothing left, no job, no money, no home that felt safe. No sister she could reach without going through people she wasn't sure she trusted anymore. And now, no Julian either. Not for the moment. Not until whatever this was got sorted out in rooms she had no access to. Julian's words kept circling back. Trust no one. Not even my blood. She had one number in her phone for anyone connected to that world, and it belonged to a man she'd met exactly once. At a dinner Julian's had insisted she attend during her first week at the compound. Arthur Vanson's uncle. A soft-spoken man with kind eyes who'd spent the whole meal asking careful, gentle questions about Grace's treatment. Who'd told her quietly that if she ever needed anything, day or night, she should call. Harper stood on that ruined corner for a long time, phone in her hand, Julian's warning echoing against every instinct that wanted comfort right now. Wanted a kind voice and a warm room and someone who'd take care of the details for a while. In the end, exhaustion won out over caution. She told herself it was just for tonight, just until she figured out where else to go. She dialed Arthur's number. He answered on the second ring, wide awake despite the hour, voice full of an alarm that sounded, in the moment, entirely genuine. Harper, thank God, I just heard about the fire. Where are you? I don't know what to do, she admitted, and her voice finally cracked. All the strength she'd been rationing since the wine bottle hit her floor finally running dry. They took Julian, my accounts are empty. The restaurant's gone, stay exactly where you are. Arthur said, I'm sending a car, you're safe now. I promise you. You're safe. Harper closed her eyes and let herself believe him. Because the alternative was standing alone on a smoking street corner with nowhere else in the world to go. Arthur's house looked nothing like Julian's compound. No cameras tucked into corners. No reinforced glass. Just old money dressed up as comfort. Dark wood and soft lighting and a fire crackling in a hearth that had probably never known a moment of real danger. He'd met her at the door himself. Wrapped her in a cashmere throw before she'd even finished apologizing for showing up in soot-streaked clothes with no shoes. And settled her into a leather chair across from his own, like she was something precious that needed careful handling. A housekeeper brought tea. Arthur asked about the fire, about Julian, about Grace. In a voice so gentle Harper found herself talking more than she meant to. The whole story spilling out in pieces. The fire, the drained accounts, the SWAT team dragging Julian into an armored van. They can't hold him, Arthur said, shaking his head. Not without evidence that will actually stand. This is thorn buying time. Nothing more. We'll have Julian out within the week. A week, Harper's stomach twisted. Grace's treatment schedule doesn't wait a week. I'll make some calls in the morning. We'll make sure she's covered, whatever it takes. He reached across and patted her hand, warm, avuncular, exactly what she needed to hear after a night like this one. You did the right thing. Calling me. Julian trusts very few people in this life. I like to think I've earned a place on that very short list. Harper wrapped both hands around her tea and let the heat of it settle something in her chest. For the first time in hours, her shoulders came down from around her ears. He told me not to trust anyone, she said, mostly to herself. Not even his blood. Something crossed Arthur's face. So brief she almost missed it. Gone before she could name what it had looked like. Julian says a lot of things when he's frightened, Arthur said smoothly. He's not wrong to be cautious. This life makes paranoids of all of us eventually. But you can trust me. Harper, I raised that boy after his father passed. I've protected this family for 30 years. He reached into his jacket for a handkerchief, dabbing at something on his sleeve, and as he pulled it free, a small object slipped loose and fell to the floor between them, landing with a soft click against the hardwood. Harper looked down out of habit more than suspicion. A bracelet. Red thread. Braided in a pattern she'd know anywhere, because her own fingers had woven it 2 days ago. Sitting beside Grace's hospital bed. Teaching her sister the pattern their grandmother used to make. She'd tied it around Grace's wrist herself, watched the nurse fasten the clasp. Grace never took it off. Not for scans. Not for sleep. Not for anything. It shouldn't have been anywhere near this house. Harper's whole body went very still. The same stillness from her apartment doorway, the kind that wasn't calm at all. Just her mind buying itself time to understand what it was looking at. That's a beautiful little thing, Arthur said, bending to retrieve it, tucking it back into his jacket before Harper could get a proper look. A keepsake. From my late wife, he was lying. Harper had woven that bracelet with her own 2 hands. She knew every knot in it, every uneven stitch where she'd had to redo a section because her fingers weren't as steady as her grandmother's had been. There was no version of the world where Arthur's late wife owned an identical one, down to the mismatched knot at the clasp, which meant Arthur had been close enough to Grace to take it off her wrist, or close enough to whoever was guarding her. Harper's heart hammered against her ribs so loudly she was certain he must be able to hear it. But she'd spent 6 years reading customers who lied about allergies and complained about food they'd already eaten half of, and she called on every ounce of that training now. She let her eyes go wide and glassy. She let her lower lip tremble. Just slightly. Just enough. It really is beautiful, she said, voice small and unsteady. I'm sorry. I think it's just been a very long night. Would it be all right if I used your computer? I wanted to check on Grace's status. Make sure the transfer went through okay before I try to sleep. Of course, Arthur stood, gesturing toward a study down the hall, his voice warm and patient. Exactly the tone of a man with nothing to hide. Take all the time you need. I'll have the housekeeper prepare a room for you. The moment he left the study, Harper's hands stopped shaking with fear and started shaking with focus instead. She sat at his desk and woke the computer, grateful for the first time in her life. For every late night she'd spent teaching herself basic system work while Grace slept through chemo sessions in the next room. Back when learning something useful felt like the only thing she could control about a life spinning away from her. It wasn't hacking. Not really. Nothing sophisticated. Arthur was an old man who trusted his own security too much, whose password manager auto-filled the moment she opened his email, whose private server login sat pinned at the top of his browser history like an invitation. She found the folder in under 4 minutes. Financial transfers routed through shell accounts, messages between Arthur and a contact saved only as ST, photographs of the compound's security blueprints, the same ones Marcus had supposedly leaked, time-stamped from before Marcus had ever been suspected. And beneath all of it, buried 3 folders deep, a file labeled with Grace's real name and the address of the facility where she was supposed to be safe. Marcus hadn't been the mole. Marcus had been the fall guy, sacrificed by a man patient enough to let his own nephew execute an innocent traitor while the real one sat across a dinner table asking gentle questions about a dying teenager's treatment schedule. Harper's hands trembled now, but not from fear, from the effort of staying calm enough to work. She copied everything onto a small drive she found in the desk, then opened a private message window and sent the files, every single one, to the only lawyer's contact Julian had ever given her. A woman named Priya, who specialized in exactly the kind of legal mess Julian was currently sitting in. Harper typed as fast as her shaking hands would let her, explaining what she'd found, what it meant, where Arthur's real loyalties actually lived. She hit send just as she heard footsteps in the hallway. By the time Arthur reappeared in the doorway, Harper had already closed the browser and turned to face him with the same trembling, grateful smile she'd worn since she walked through his front door. All set, he asked. All set, Harper said. Thank you, Arthur, truly. I don't know what I would have done tonight without you. That's what family is for, he said and smiled. And Harper smiled back and understood, in that single exchange, that she was now sitting in a house with a man who had already decided, somewhere along the way, that her sister's life was worth less than his own ambitions. The files reached Priya within the hour. Priya reached a judge within 2. By morning, the fabricated evidence behind Julian's arrest had started to unravel in exactly the places Arthur hadn't expected anyone to look. And somewhere across the city, a cell door swung open. Harper didn't get to see it happen. She was still sitting in Arthur's guest room, pretending to sleep, when she heard the front gate crash inward and Julian's voice, raw and furious, shouting her name through the halls of his uncle's mansion. She was out of bed and into the hallway before she'd even finished processing that he was free, that he'd come for her the moment he was. And for one blinding second, relief was the only thing in the room. Then she saw Arthur standing at the top of the stairs, calm as ever, a small black remote resting easily in his open palm. Checkmate, Arthur said, and looked directly at Harper as he said it, like he wanted her to understand, in this final moment, exactly whose game she'd been playing without knowing it. He pressed the button. The explosion took the east wing first, a roar so total it swallowed every other sound in the house. And the last thing Harper remembered clearly was Julian's body slamming into hers, wrapping around her like armor, driving them both down through a doorway as the ceiling came apart above them in fire and plaster and glass. Then nothing, for a while. Just ringing, and dust, and a weight on top of her that she eventually understood was Julian, not moving fast enough, breathing wrong. Julian, her own voice sounded far away, muffled through the ringing in her ears. Julian, get up. Please, he groaned and rolled off her. One hand pressed to a gash along his ribs that had soaked clean through his shirt. And for a moment, they just lay there together in the wreckage of a study that had, hours earlier, held every secret Arthur had spent decades protecting. We need to move, he said, voice rough with smoke. Now, before the rest of it comes down. They made it out through a side door that had somehow survived the blast, stumbling across a lawn littered with debris, sirens already building in the distance. Julian didn't stop to check if Arthur had survived. Harper understood, without needing to ask, that whatever happened to Arthur next was a conversation for another day, one that would take place far from any courtroom Thorne's money could touch. Julian drove them out of the city with one hand on the wheel and the other pressed against his side, refusing every offer to pull over, refusing every suggestion that maybe, just maybe, he should let someone else drive. Harper watched him grow paler with every mile and finally reached over, without asking, and took the wheel herself the second he started to sway. "Where are we going?" she asked. Once he'd slumped back against the seat, eyes half closed. "North," he said. "There's a cabin. Off the grid. Nobody knows about it. Not Arthur. Not Thorne. Not anyone still breathing." The drive took most of the day, winding higher and higher into mountains that grew whiter with every mile, until the roads narrowed to little more than packed snow between walls of pine. The cabin, when they finally reached it, looked like something out of a different life entirely. Small and simple. Smoke curling lazily from a chimney that had clearly been fitted with an automated system, wood stacked neat beside the door. Harper got Julian inside and onto the bed before her own legs gave out from exhaustion. She found a first aid kit in the bathroom, more thorough than anything she'd expect in a place this remote, and set to work cleaning and stitching the gash along his ribs with hands that had gone steady again, now that there was something useful to do with them. "You've done this before," Julian said, watching her work, wincing only slightly as the needle passed through skin. "Grace," Harper said simply. "You learn fast when someone you love keeps ending up in hospital beds. Emergencies room nurses taught me more than I ever wanted to know." She tied off the last stitch and sat back, surveying her work with a critical eye. "You'll live. Try not to test that theory again anytime soon." "No promises, Julian, I'm trying," he said, and something in his voice made her look up from the bandage. "I'm trying to be a different man than the one who sat in that restaurant for 6 weeks, making you feel small. I don't always know how, but I'm trying." Harper sat beside him on the edge of the bed, exhaustion finally catching up with both of them at once. The adrenaline of the last 2 days draining out and leaving something rawer underneath. "You keep apologizing with actions instead of words," she said. "That matters more than you think it does." They stayed in that cabin for 3 days, the world outside reduced to snow and pine and the slow, patient work of healing. Julian's wound closed. The bruises faded from purple to green to something almost forgettable. And in the quiet, away from compounds and restaurants and men with guns, they found something neither of them had expected to find in the middle of a war: peace, or something close enough to count. On the second night, sitting by the fire with a blanket wrapped around both their shoulders, Julian told her about the empire his father had built, the men it had cost, the families it had broken, including his own. He talked about growing up watching his mother shrink herself smaller and smaller inside a marriage that called itself protection, and about swearing, as a boy, that he'd never become the man causing that particular kind of damage. "And then I became exactly that," he said. "The first time it mattered, you stopped." Harper said, That's the part that matters more. I want to dismantle it, he said, and the words came out steadier than she expected. Like he'd been turning them over for days before finally saying them out loud. All of it. The syndicate. The territories. The whole rotten structure my father built out of fear. I want to use what's left of the money for something that doesn't require anyone to bleed for it. Like what? A foundation, he said, for families like yours. People buried under medical debt they didn't choose and can't outrun. People who need someone to look at them and see a person worth saving instead of a liability worth managing. Harper looked at him for a long moment. Firelight flickering across a face that had learned, slowly and painfully, the difference between control and care. That sounds like a good place to start, she said. Building something instead of just guarding it. Julian reached over and laced his fingers through hers. And for the first time since the night the wine hit his suit. Harper let herself imagine an ending to all of this that didn't involve fear. A restaurant rebuilt. A sister healthy. A man beside her instead of over her. Learning every single day how to hold power without using it as a cage. They fell asleep that night with the fire still burning low. Wrapped together under blankets that smelled like wood smoke and pine. Further from danger than either of them had felt in weeks. Harper woke first, sometime near dawn, to a cold that had no business being inside a cabin with a working stove. She sat up slowly, blinking against the gray morning light, and felt the wrongness of the room before she understood it. No warmth from the fireplace. No soft hum from the security panel by the door, the one Julian had checked obsessively every night before bed. Just silence and cold, and the particular kind of stillness that meant something had already gone very wrong while they slept. She swung her legs out of bed, bare feet hitting floorboards that had gone icy overnight, and padded toward the kitchen, already half expecting to find the power simply out. A fuse tripped by the storm that had rolled through sometime after midnight. Instead, sitting square in the middle of the kitchen island, was Grace's stuffed rabbit. The one she'd carried through every hospital stay since she was 7 years old, one ear worn thin from years of anxious fingers. The one Harper had tucked into her sister's arms herself, 3 states away, in a facility that was supposed to be untraceable. It was soaked through with blood. Harper's scream tore out of her before her mind had even finished understanding what she was looking at. Loud enough to shatter the mountain quiet. Loud enough to bring Julian stumbling out of bed with a gun already in his hand. Loud enough to announce, to whatever was listening out there in the snow, exactly where to find them. The first shot came before Harper had even set the rabbit down. It punched through the kitchen window and buried itself in the cabinet above her head, spraying splinters across the counter. And Julian was moving before the sound had finished echoing, shoving her down behind the island, gun already up and tracking toward the tree line. How many? Harper asked, crouched low, heart slamming against her ribs. Too many to count from here. Julian's voice had gone flat. The same cold calculation she'd heard the night he cleared her apartment. They cut the power before they moved in. No lights, no cameras, no warning. Professional. Another round of fire raked across the front of the cabin, and Harper flinched at the sound of glass giving way in the front room. Julian dragged her deeper into the kitchen, toward the pantry, and pressed a spare pistol into her hands. The same steady weight he'd offered her once before under very different circumstances. You know how to use this, you taught me. 2 days ago. In the yard. Her hands weren't shaking. Not anymore. Not since the moment she understood that fear wasn't going to be useful right now. I was hoping I wouldn't need it this soon. Neither was I. They fought back to back through the front room, Julian taking the west windows, Harper covering the door. Trading fire with shapes she could barely make out against the gray morning light and the falling snow. It should have terrified her more than it did. Instead, something in her had gone quiet and precise. The same version of herself that used to read an entire dining room in a single glance, now reading angles and cover and the rhythm of gunfire instead. Grace, she said, between exchanges. Voice cracking on the name. If they have her. Julian, if that blood on the rabbit means don't, he said, sharp. Not unkind. We don't know anything yet. Focus on staying alive long enough to find out. They held the cabin for what felt like an hour, though Harper suspected it was closer to 20 minutes. adrenaline stretching every second into something longer and sharper than it actually was. Julian's wound had reopened somewhere in the fighting, blood soaking dark through the bandage she'd stitched 2 nights ago. And his movements had started slowing in a way that made her stomach twist every time she caught it. Then his gun clicked empty. A second later, hers did the same. The silence that followed was worse than the gunfire. Harper heard boots crunching through snow, closing in from every direction. Unhurried now, the way men move when they know the fight is already over. Julian looked at her across the wreckage of the cabin, and something passed over his face that she'd never seen there before. Not in the restaurant, not in her apartment, not even in the moment he'd offered her a gun and asked her to shoot him. It looked like grief. It looked like a decision already made. "No," she said, reading it before he'd said a word. "Whatever you're thinking. No, they have your sister." His voice was steady, terribly steady. The voice of a man who'd already run every scenario and landed on the only one that gave anyone else a chance. "I don't know if that blood means she's alive or not. But if there's a version of this where you get her back, I'm not going to be the reason you don't take it. Julian, I love you." He said it simply, without ceremony, like it was the most obvious fact in a world that had stopped making sense hours ago. "I loved you before I understood what the word meant, and I understand it now because of you. That's not nothing. Whatever happens in the next 5 minutes," he set down his empty gun, before Harper could grab his arm, before she could do anything but scream his name. He was already walking toward the front door, with his hands raised above his head, blood dripping from his fingertips onto the snow, shouting into the gray morning at men she couldn't see. "Ceasefire. You hear me? Ceasefire." The gunfire around the cabin stuttered, then stopped. Harper scrambled after him, reaching the doorway just in time to see a dozen armed men emerging from the tree line, weapons still trained on the cabin, and at the center of them, unhurried, wrapped in a wool coat that looked entirely too comfortable for a mountain firefight, stood Silas Thorne. He looked exactly like she'd pictured him from every fearful whisper she'd heard about him over the past week. Handsome in a way that made the cruelty underneath more unsettling, not less. He smiled when he saw Julian standing in the doorway with his hands up, like a man greeting an old friend he'd been looking forward to seeing again. "Julian," Thorne called out, pleasant, almost warm. "I was starting to think you'd never invite me up." "Take the girl," Julian said, ignoring the pleasantry entirely. "Let her sister go. That's the deal. She's yours. And this ends." "Julian, no." Harper grabbed his sleeve, and he didn't turn, didn't look at her. Kept his eyes fixed on Thorne with the same flat calculation he'd used against Arthur's men. "Deal's a deal," he said again, louder this time, for Thorne's benefit as much as hers. "You wanted leverage from the beginning. Here she is. Walk away. And leave the kid alone." Thorne's smile widened, and he gestured, almost lazy, and two of his men peeled off toward the doorway. Harper felt hands close around her arms before she'd fully processed what was happening, dragging her backward off the porch. And she twisted, kicking, screaming his name into a morning that had already taken so much from her and now, apparently, intended to take this too. "Julian," her voice tore raw. "You promised me equals. You promised." He didn't answer. He stood in that doorway with his hands still raised, watching them drag her away, and his face was a wall, empty of anything, closed off in a way that felt like the deepest betrayal of everything he'd told her in that cabin 2 nights ago. They forced her into the trunk of a black SUV, and the last thing she saw before the lid slammed down was Julian, still standing in the cabin doorway, still not moving to stop it, surrounded by Thorne's men like a king surrendering his crown without so much as a fight. The dark swallowed her whole. The warehouse smelled like rust and standing water, the kind of cold that got into a person's bones and stayed there. Harper sat chained to a steel folding chair in the middle of a concrete floor, wrists raw from struggling against restraints that hadn't given an inch in what felt like hours. She'd stopped counting the hours somewhere, after the second time Thorne's men had come to check on her, satisfied themselves she wasn't going anywhere, and left again without a word. The isolation was its own kind of cruelty, worse in some ways than violence would have been, because it left her alone with every worst possibility her mind wanted to hand her: Grace's face. The bloodied rabbit. Julian's empty expression as they dragged her off that porch. The heavy metal door at the far end of the warehouse finally groaned open, and Harper braced herself against the chair, ready for another round of Thorne's men. Another round of waiting. Instead, Silas Thorne walked in himself, and beside him, unhurried, hands loose at his sides, walked Julian Vance. Harper's chest caved in on itself. She'd spent the last several hours convincing herself there had to be an explanation, some plan she wasn't seeing. Something more than a man simply handing her over and walking away clean. Seeing him now, standing shoulder to shoulder with the man who'd burned her restaurant and kidnapped her sister, stripped that hope away in a single breath. There she is, Thorne said, almost fond, circling her chair like she was an exhibit at a museum. I have to say, Julian, I underestimated her. Took real nerve. Pouring that wine on you. I watched the video a dozen times. She has nerve, Julian said, and his voice was flat, businesslike, a stranger's voice. Doesn't change the arithmetic. Harper's eyes found his, searching for some crack in the wall, some flicker of the man who'd stitched his own broken ribs while promising her a life built on equal footing instead of cages. She found nothing, just cold calculation. The same version of him she'd first met across a restaurant table 6 weeks and a lifetime ago. The arithmetic, Thorne repeated, amused. Go on then, lay it out for the lady. Julian's eyes didn't leave hers as he spoke, and that was almost the cruelest part. That he could say what came next while looking directly at her. Arthur survived the blast, he said. He's currently a liability neither of us can afford. Sitting in a hospital bed somewhere with enough information to bury both our organizations if the wrong people ever get to him first. Mr. Thorne is going to make sure that doesn't happen. In exchange, I'm signing over 3 of my territories and half my remaining assets. And the girl, Thorne asked, gesturing at Harper like she was a line item on a balance sheet. Yours to keep, Julian said. She was never part of the negotiation, just the reason it started. Something inside Harper's chest went hollow and quiet, past anger now, into a kind of numb disbelief that felt worse than any pain the ropes had given her. She thought about the fire in his voice at the cabin, telling her about the foundation he wanted to build, the man he was trying to become. She thought about how easily that man had apparently evaporated the second real leverage was on the table. Your disposable collateral, Thorne told her, almost gently, like he was doing her a kindness by explaining it plainly. That's the truth of this world, sweetheart. Men like Julian, men like his father before him, they don't build empires by keeping promises to waitresses. Harper lifted her chin. Whatever was happening, whatever Julian had actually become behind that flat stranger's expression, she wasn't going to let either of these men watch her break. You can chain my body, she said, voice steady despite the cold and the exhaustion and the ache in her wrists, but you will never own my soul. Neither of you. I've had 2 men in this life try to strip away my dignity by controlling what I have. Neither of you succeeded, and you're not going to start now. Thorne laughed, delighted, clapping slowly. She's magnificent, truly, a shame, really, how this is going to end for her. He turned to discuss logistics with one of his lieutenants, stepping a few feet away, and Julian used the moment to walk closer to Harper's chair, closing the distance with the same unhurried calm he'd carried since walking through that door. He crouched down, ostensibly checking the tightness of her restraints, and his hand brushed against her thigh as he did it. Harper almost pulled away out of reflex. Then she felt it. A rhythm, deliberate, pressed against her skin with his index finger. Tap, 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 tap. Her whole body went still, recognition flooding through her so fast it nearly stole her breath. They'd worked it out together during her second night at the compound, sitting up late after a security briefing. Julian insisting she learn a handful of basic signals in case they were ever separated during an operation. Duck, run, wait, cover, tap, 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 duck. Julian's face gave away nothing as he straightened up, walking back toward Thorne with the same cold, businesslike posture he'd carried since arriving. But Harper understood now, with a rush of relief so overwhelming it nearly buckled her in the chair, that the wall she'd been reading as betrayal was actually armor. A performance, carefully constructed, precise enough to fool a man who'd built his whole career reading liars. It hadn't been surrender in that cabin doorway either. It had been the opening move of a plan she hadn't been given the details of, because there hadn't been time. Because the only way to sell it convincingly to Thorne was to make sure even Harper believed it, at least for a while. She thought about Chapter 3, kneeling in her own wrecked apartment, the conversations that had started all of this. Ask, instead of deciding. Tell the truth even when it's inconvenient. She'd meant it as a lesson for him. Somewhere in the last week, without either of them quite noticing the moment it happened, it had become a lesson for both of them about what trust actually required. Sometimes trust meant believing in a signal tapped against your skin even when every visible sign in the room told you to believe the opposite. Harper kept her face carefully arranged, the same defiant mask she'd been wearing since Thorne walked in, giving nothing away while her mind raced through what came next. Duck meant something was coming. She just had to be ready when it did. "You've gone quiet," Thorne observed, turning back toward her, something suspicious flickering across his expression for the first time since he'd entered the warehouse. "Just thinking," Harper said, "about how men like you always assume the woman in the chair is the only one without a plan." Thorne's smile faltered just slightly, just enough to tell her he didn't like the sound of that at all. Behind him, unnoticed, Julian's hand moved toward the small blade concealed inside his sleeve. The lights went out all at once. 1 second, the warehouse was lit by industrial fluorescence buzzing overhead, and the next it was total darkness, thick enough to swallow every shape in the room. Thorne shouted something, furious and confused, and his men scrambled for flashlights that took precious seconds to click on. Seconds that Julian had clearly been counting on from the very beginning. Harper heard him move before she saw anything. A controlled blur through the dark. The soft click of a hidden ceramic blade finding its mark against the nearest guard. A body hit the floor, then another. Thorne's men, trained for firepower and numbers, hadn't planned for a fight in total blackness against a man who'd grown up learning to move through exactly this kind of chaos. Harper had been busy too, the moment the lights died. Her fingers found the hairpin she'd tucked into the lining of her sleeve back at the cabin, back when Julian had first started teaching her the small, practical skills that came with surviving his world. She'd practiced picking the restraints twice already during the long hours alone in that chair, just in case. Just to have something to do with the fear. This time, in the dark, with real urgency behind her fingers, the lock finally gave. She didn't wait to be rescued. That was the whole point. The lesson that had carried her through every disaster since the night she'd poured wine on a stranger in a crowded restaurant. She was done being something that happened to. She was ready to be something that acted. Harper slipped free of the chair and moved low along the wall, the way Julian had drilled into her during those quiet compound evenings, toward the small glass-walled control room she'd spotted earlier, back when the lights were still on and she'd been cataloging every exit and every weakness out of pure habit. A man sat inside, cyber director judging by the array of monitors, scrambling to bring the power back online. She hit him before he registered she was there, the flat of her palm driving up into his jaw the way Julian had shown her, and he went down hard against the console. Harper didn't spare him a second look. She was already scanning the controls, searching for anything that resembled a lockdown system, fingers flying across a keyboard that felt, for the first time in her life, like a genuine weapon instead of a tool for checking bank balances she no longer had. She found it. A warehouse-wide security override. The kind of system men like Thorne installed to keep enemies out and never imagined might be used to keep his own reinforcements from getting in. Harper's hands shook, adrenaline and cold and exhaustion all fighting for space in her chest. But she made herself steady, made herself precise, and locked every door leading into the warehouse from the outside. Through the glass, she watched a dozen more of Thorne's men pile up against a bay door that refused to budge, shouting to radios that were about to be entirely useless. The main lights flickered back on a moment later, someone finally finding an alternate breaker, and the warehouse floor came into full view. Julian stood in the middle of the wreckage, 3 men down around him, breathing hard but upright, blade still gripped in one bloodied hand. Silas Thorne stood a dozen feet away, the only man left standing between them, gun raised and trembling with a rage that had finally cracked through his composure. Harper stepped out of the control room and walked toward them both, unhurried, refusing to run, refusing to give either man the satisfaction of watching her scared. "It's over, Silas," Julian said. "Your men are locked out. Your empire's about to be a lot smaller than it was this morning. You'll die before that happens." Thorne snarled, guns swinging between them, uncertain which target mattered more. Julian moved first, closing the distance faster than Thorne could track, knocking the gun wide as it fired into empty air. The two men grappled, and for a moment it looked even, brutal and close, until Julian finally drove Thorne down onto the concrete and pinned the gun beneath his own boot. Harper reached them just as Julian straightened up, breathing hard, blood mixing old and new down his side. He looked at her, then down at Thorne, and held the gun out toward her. Grip first, the same gesture he'd once offered in her wrecked apartment as an apology. This time it wasn't an apology. It was a choice. "He's yours," Julian said, "after everything he's taken. Your restaurant, your sister, your peace. If you want to end this yourself, I won't stop you." Harper looked down at Thorne, sprawled and bleeding and finally afraid. And she understood, with total clarity, exactly what kind of ending she wanted for this story. "No," she said, and didn't take the gun. "We don't kill him. We destroy him." She crossed to the control room instead, sat down at the console still glowing with the cyber director's abandoned session, and pulled up the financial records she'd glimpsed scrolling past during her lockdown. Ledgers, wire transfers, names of judges and officials who'd taken Thorne's money to look the other way. All of it sitting there, unprotected. Exactly the kind of arrogance that came from a man who'd never expected to lose control of his own warehouse. Julian appeared in the doorway behind her, Thorne restrained now on the floor outside, and watched without a word as Harper compiled everything into a single file. "You could take his empire," Julian said quietly, "same way Arthur wanted mine. There's a version of this where you walk out of here more powerful than either of us." "I don't want an empire," Harper said, fingers steady on the keys now, all the shaking finally gone. "I want people like Grace to never have to worry about a hospital pulling their bed because someone with money decided their life was inconvenient." She hit enter. The files transmitted in seconds. Every ledger. Every bribed official. Every dollar Thorne had ever laundered through shell companies and silent partners. Sent directly to an FBI contact Priya had given her weeks ago, back when this had still felt like Julian's fight instead of her own. Somewhere across the city, phones were about to start ringing in offices that would very quickly stop protecting Silas Thorne. 6 months later, the snow had melted off the mountain roads, and Julian Vance had done something no one in his family had managed in 3 generations. He'd walked away from an empire instead of expanding it. The Vance syndicate was gone, dissolved piece by piece. Territories sold off or handed over to legitimate businesses. The criminal infrastructure his father had spent a lifetime building, dismantled by the son who'd finally understood that real strength wasn't measured in how much fear a man could generate. Grace had recovered fully. Treatment completed at a facility that never once threatened to pull her bed. Medical bills a distant memory instead of a daily terror. Harper visited her every week now. Watched her sister's hair grow back thick and dark. Watched her laugh in a way that had nothing guarded in it anymore. Arthur had survived his injuries. He was currently facing trial for treason against his own family. Testimony from Julian's lawyer stacked high enough to guarantee he'd never again sit in a leather chair pouring tea for a frightened young woman with nowhere else to turn. On a bright afternoon in early spring, Julian drove Harper to the empty lot where her restaurant used to stand. The one Thorne's men had burned to the ground. The last physical trace of the life she'd lived before any of this began, except it wasn't empty anymore. A new building stood on the site, glass and warm brick. A sign above the door reading the Harper Evans Culinary Academy. Through the windows, Harper could see a kitchen full of students, women of every shape and size, learning knife work and plating, and the particular confidence that came from being trusted with something that mattered. "You did this?" she asked. Throat tight. "We did this," Julian said. "I just signed the checks." He led her inside, past the kitchens, past a wall of framed photographs documenting the academy's first graduating class, until they reached a quiet office at the back of the building. He handed her a thick folder. Harper opened it slowly. Inside was the legal deed to the entire property, her name listed as sole owner, and beneath it, a second document establishing a trust fund in Grace's name, dedicated entirely to pediatric leukemia research. Julian, this is? I used to think power meant making the world fear me, Julian said, and got down on one knee in front of her. Right there in the small office, with the sound of students laughing somewhere down the hall. No box, no blood diamond ring pulled from a velvet case, just his hand open, offering her nothing but the truth of what he'd finally learned. You taught me that real power means making sure people like you never have to be afraid again. I don't have a ring that means anything close to what you've given me. I have this instead, a life built beside you, not over you for as long as you'll have me. Harper looked at the deed in her hands, at the man kneeling in front of her who'd spent 6 weeks mocking her before spending 6 months learning how to be worthy of her, and felt every jagged piece of the last year settle into something whole. Will you lead this new life with me? He asked. She pulled him up by the collar instead of answering right away, close enough that the whole academy could probably hear whatever came next, and let herself smile the way she hadn't smiled since long before any of this started. Curves and confidence and every ounce of dignity she'd refused to hand over. Yes, she said. Partner. In the end. Harper Evans' story is not only about a waitress who poured wine on a mafia boss, or a dangerous man who learned the hard way that cruelty can never be mistaken for protection. It is a story about dignity, courage, and the power of a woman who refused to let pain turn her into someone cruel. Harper began this journey as someone the world thought it could laugh at. People mocked her body, dismissed her work, judged her from a viral video, and tried to reduce her entire life to one humiliating moment. But they never understood the truth. Harper was never weak. She was tired, wounded, and afraid, but she was never powerless. The moment she stood in that restaurant and said, "You can mock my body, but you can touch what is inside it," she reminded every viewer that self-worth is not given by society. It is claimed from within. Julian Vance's journey gives us another lesson just as important. He believed protection meant control. He thought that if he pushed Harper away, humiliated her, and made her hate him, he could keep her alive. But safety without respect is not love. It is a cage. Harper taught him that real love does not stand above someone and make decisions for them. Real love stands beside them, tells the truth, and gives them the right to choose. Julian's redemption did not come from power, money, or violence. It came from learning humility. It came from admitting he was wrong and choosing to become better. The heart of this story is transformation. Harper did not defeat Silas Thorne by becoming like him. She did not choose blood when she had the chance. She chose justice. She chose to expose the corruption, protect families like Grace S., and build something meaningful from the ashes of everything she lost. That is why her victory matters. She did not want an empire. She wanted a world where sick children were not treated like financial burdens, where women were not mocked for their bodies, and where power could be used to heal instead of destroy. So the message of this story is clear. Never let humiliation define you. Never let anyone convince you that your worth depends on your appearance, your job, your money, or their approval. The person the world laughs at today may be the person strong enough to bring an empire down tomorrow. Harper was not just a waitress. She was a sister, a survivor, a fighter, and finally, a partner. And in choosing dignity over revenge, justice over cruelty, and love over control, she proved that the strongest people are not the ones who never fall. They are the ones who rise with their heart still intact. This book is a work of imagination. Names, characters, places, and incidents either are products of the author's creativity or are used fictitiously. Any resemblance to real persons or actual events is unintentional and should not be construed as factual representation.